The Widow Who Locked Every Door. A Miss Marple Mystery, England, 1955. Chapter 1. The Parish Fête and Its Unexpected Guest. The village of Wychford Parva had not seen a summer fête quite so well attended since 1947, when Colonel Thistlethwaite had arranged for a genuine brass band to perform beside the duck pond, and 3 people had fallen in. That occasion was still spoken of with the particular warmth the English reserve for minor catastrophes. This year's fête, organised by the Women's Institute on the second Saturday of July, promised nothing so dramatic bunting, a jumble table, Mrs. Pooley's extraordinary Victoria sponge, and the usual tombola with its usual prizes. Modest pleasures, and all the more comfortable for it. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 11:30, carrying a small basket that contained her knitting, a folded mackintosh, one could never be certain about July, and a paper bag of butterscotch she had been meaning to give to the vicar's wife. She wore her customary lavender-grey cardigan and her best summer hat, the one with the cream ribbon, which she reserved for outdoor occasions that required a measure of social effort. The fête was held on the green behind St. Bartholomew's Church, and from the gate Miss Marple could see the whole of it spread before her like an illustration from a particularly cheerful annual. A ring of stalls, children with ice cream cones, the competitive chaos of the coconut shy, and at the far end, under a wide canvas awning, the refreshment tables where the serious business of tea and cake was conducted. It was toward these tables that Miss Marple directed her steps, since it was at the refreshment table that one heard everything worth hearing. She had not gone 30 feet, however, before she encountered something considerably more interesting than a Victoria sponge. Standing at the entrance to the tomb, looking rather as though she had arrived at the wrong fête entirely and was too proud to say so, was a woman Miss Marple had never seen before in Wychford Parva. That was remarkable in itself. The village had a population of roughly 400 souls, and Miss Marple, who had lived in St. Mary Mead but was visiting her nephew Raymond's old university friend, Dr. Gerald Purbeck, and his wife Anne, knew the surrounding villages almost as well as her own. This woman was a stranger. She was perhaps 55, handsome in the angular way of women who had once been beautiful and had let severity replace what time had taken. Her hair was iron grey, set in rigid waves beneath a black hat, not mourning black, rather the black of a woman who had decided that colour was a vanity she had outgrown. She wore black gloves despite the warmth of the day. Her eyes moved across the crowd with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite contempt, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between the two. "That," murmured Mrs. Anne Purbeck, appearing at Miss Marple's elbow with a cup of tea she had clearly been carrying some distance, "is Miriam Tate. She came to Wychford Parva 8 months ago, took Hazel Lodge on a long lease, and has spoken to approximately 7 people in the village since her arrival. She does not attend church, she does not attend the WI, she does not attend anything. Today is, to my knowledge, the first time she has left her house on a Saturday." "Good gracious," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "And what does one know about her?" "Very little. Widowed. Her husband, a Mr. Arthur Tate, died 2 years ago, somewhere in Shropshire, I believe. She has money, though whether it's her own or was his, nobody is entirely certain. She has a companion who comes in daily, a woman named Vera Colstock, a local girl, and a gardener who she dismissed 3 weeks after hiring him and replaced with nobody. The garden is going to seed." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and watched Miriam Tate purchase a tombola ticket, examine it without apparent pleasure, and deposit the losing stub in the waste bin with a gesture of resigned confirmation. She then stood quite still for nearly 2 minutes, as though conducting some private census of the crowd, before turning and walking with deliberate purpose toward the refreshment awning. "She keeps the house locked," Anne Purbeck added, with the tone of a woman offering the most interesting piece of evidence for last. "All the windows, even in this weather," Vera Colstock told Beryl Huggins, the newsagent's wife, "that there are bolts on every interior door as well, not just the outside doors. Every room." "Does she indeed?" said Miss Marple softly. It was at precisely this moment that a sharp, carrying voice said, "I did not expect to find you here," and the fête, which had been proceeding in its comfortable English fashion, lurched sideways. The voice belonged to a man who had just come through the gate, tall, about 40, with the kind of face that suggested he had once been considered good-looking and still relied on that assumption. He wore a pale summer suit and carried a straw hat, and he was looking directly at Miriam Tate with an expression that could not, by any charitable interpretation, be called friendly. Miriam Tate turned, and the colour, what little of it she possessed, drained entirely from her face. "Philip," she said. A single word, and in it Miss Marple heard something that she would think about carefully later, not fear, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a woman who had spent 8 months building walls around herself and had just heard a knock at the gate. "You've been rather difficult to find," said the man called Philip, stopping 6 feet from her. His voice was pleasant on the surface, the kind of pleasantness that has been deliberately applied over something less agreeable. "I thought I'd have to try every village in 4 counties. You didn't make it easy." "I did not intend to make it easy," said Miriam Tate. Several people nearby had ceased to pretend they were not listening. The tombola volunteer, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Goss, had paused with a roll of tickets in her hand. 3 children had stopped eating their ice cream, which was quite something. "We should speak privately," Philip said. "I have nothing to say to you." "I have rather a lot to say to you." There was a brief, dense silence. Then Miriam Tate said, "Come to the house at 4 o'clock. I will give you 30 minutes. She turned and walked away through the crowd with the straightness of posture that comes not from confidence, but from a determined refusal to show anything at all. Philip watched her go, then put his straw hat back on his head and smiled to nobody in particular, though Miss Marple, standing 8 feet away with her cup of tea, observed that the smile did not reach any part of his face that was under voluntary control. He purchased a portion of strawberries and cream and sat down at one of the tables as though he had not a care in the world. Miss Marple decided to get her butterscotch to the vicar's wife later. There were more immediate priorities. Chapter 2. The Man in the Pale Suit. His name, Miss Marple, established over the course of the next hour and a half, was Philip Carver. He told this to no fewer than 4 people within her earshot, since he was the sort of man who introduced himself constantly and waited to see whether the name produced recognition. In Wychford Parva, it produced none, which seemed simultaneously to relieve and to irritate him. He was from Shropshire. He mentioned Shropshire 4 times. He had known Miriam Tate, he told Mrs. Goss at the tomb. For many years he put it no more precisely than that, and when Mrs. Goss pressed him in her jolly, oblivious way, he redirected the conversation with a fluency that Miss Marple noted. He practiced redirecting. She found a seat near the refreshment table, from which she could observe Philip Carver's progress around the fete. He ate his strawberries, he won a pot of marmalade at the coconut shy, and looked genuinely pleased, which was the most natural expression she had seen on him. He spoke to the vicar, a mild-mannered man named Reverend Holloway, about the history of the church for a quarter of an hour, and the conversation appeared genuine, since Philip displayed real knowledge of ecclesiastical architecture. He was, Miss Marple concluded, an intelligent man who was performing being relaxed. At 3:15, a young woman arrived at the fete who made Philip Carver's performance falter visibly. She was perhaps 28, with dark hair, and her mother's angular quality softened by youth into something merely striking. She wore a blue cotton dress and carried a large basket of what appeared to be jam jars. She stopped at the gate, saw Philip, and the basket nearly went down. "That," said a voice beside Miss Marple, "is Nora Tate, Miriam's daughter. She arrived last week. Nobody knew she was coming, not even Vera Colstock, who tells us most things." The voice belonged to a compact, observant woman of about 60 who had sat down uninvited beside Miss Marple, with the self-possession of someone who has lived in a village long enough to know that uninvited conversation is simply called conversation. She introduced herself as Mrs. Dorothy Yell, rhymes with tell, not with bell, though it amounts to the same thing in a village. She was, she explained, the secretary of the WI and the primary organizer of this fete, and as such considered herself entitled to know everything. Nora Tate and Philip Carver were now speaking near the gate, too quietly to be heard at this distance, but with a body language that Miss Marple found instructive. Philip Carver had adopted the posture of a man making reasonable points. Nora had adopted the posture of a woman who had heard all of his reasonable points before and found none of them convincing. After approximately 90 seconds, she walked past him into the fete without another word. "Family trouble," said Mrs. Yell, with the satisfaction of someone watching a prediction confirmed. "I've thought about it from the beginning. You don't lock every door in a house because you're concerned about burglars." What does one lock every door for, would you say? Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Yell considered this seriously. Fear. But not ordinary fear. Something specific. Something with a name. She paused. Or a face. Nora Tate set her jam jars on the produce table with careful movements, spoke briefly to the WI woman behind it, and then moved through the fete without stopping, toward the far gate that led through the churchyard to the road beyond. She did not take any refreshment, and she did not look back at Philip Carver, but Miss Marple, watching, saw the young woman's shoulders settle lower with every step, the particular lowering of someone who has made a decision. Philip Carver watched her go, then consulted his watch. It was 25 minutes to 4. He put his straw hat back on and left the fete by the main gate. Well, said Mrs. Yell. Indeed, said Miss Marple. Chapter 3. What Vera Colstock knew. Miss Marple had a particular talent that she had never advertised, and which those who benefited from it rarely understood. She could, within a very short acquaintance, identify the person in any given situation who both knew the most and was most desirous of being asked. It was not a mystical gift. It depended on close observation of who watched, who listened, who paused before answering questions, and who specifically positioned themselves where information was likely to flow. Vera Colstock was not difficult to identify. She was a stout woman of 45 with the look of someone who performs reliability as a professional skill, and she was standing outside the baker's shop on Monday morning with a shopping basket when Miss Marple happened with the gentle inconsequentiality of someone with nowhere in particular to be to pause before the window and remark on the rather fine display of Chelsea buns. Within 12 minutes they were sitting together at the small table by the bakery window, with 2 teas and a shared slice of seed cake, and Vera Colstock was telling Miss Marple about Miriam Tate. She had worked for Mrs. Tate for 7 of the 8 months since the widow's arrival. She came every weekday from 8 until 2, did the cleaning and the shopping and the occasional cooking. Mrs. Tate, she said, was not an easy woman, but she was a fair one. She paid properly, she specified what she wanted without fussing, and she did not treat Vera as furniture, which, Vera implied, was a standard not universally met in Witchford Parva. The locks, Vera confirmed, were extraordinary. There were bolts on every door, inside and outside. The windows were fitted with additional catches that Mrs. Tate had installed herself, with a competence that Vera found both impressive and unsettling. The curtains on the ground floor were never fully drawn back. Mrs. Tate kept a torch on her bedside table and another in the kitchen drawer. "It's not that she's afraid," Vera said, turning her teacup. "I've known I was afraid. My mother was afraid of my father for 30 years, and afraid looks different. Mrs. Tate isn't frightened. She's prepared. Like she's made a very careful plan, and she's sticking to it." "A plan for what?" Miss Marple asked. Vera was quiet for a moment. "Not to be found," she said. "Or not to be reached, maybe. She said to me once, just once, that there are people who think they have claims on other people, and that the world would be better if such people understood clearly that they are wrong." Miss Marple noted the phrase claims on other people and set it aside in the careful mental filing system she maintained for other people's exact words. Exact words, in her experience, were nearly always more revealing than paraphrases. A person who says they have a claim is using the language of property of something owed, something that can be collected or withheld. A person who says they have a right is using the language of justice. The two are related but distinct, and the distinction says something about what a person believes they are owed and from whom. Miss Marple thought of Philip Carver standing at the gate of the fete, saying he had been difficult to find. Has anyone visited her? Before Saturday? Letters. She gets letters she doesn't open, and then she burns them. I've seen her do it in the kitchen sink, very methodical, with a match. And in March she had a visitor, a man, about 40, very well dressed. She wouldn't let him past the front step. They spoke for about 10 minutes on the doorstep, and then he left, and she came inside and poured herself a glass of brandy, which I've never seen her do before or since. Did you happen to hear any of what was said? Only the end, he said, and I was in the hall. I'm not ashamed to admit it, he said. You can't simply absolve yourself from your responsibilities, Miriam. It doesn't work like that. And she said, very quietly, very calmly, watch me. Miss Marple finished her tea, and the daughter, Miss Nora Tate, had she visited before last week, Vera's expression shifted into something harder. No, and when she arrived last Tuesday, late in the afternoon, Mrs. Tate was not glad to see her. I was still there. She let her in, which she wouldn't have done for the man in March, but she was not glad. She said, "How did you find me?" Nora said, "Through the solicitor." And Mrs. Tate said, "He had no business." And Nora said, "He had every business. There are legal matters." And then Mrs. Tate saw me listening and told me I could go. "Were they?" Miss Marple asked delicately. "On good terms when you last saw them together?" "Not good. Not dreadful. Like two people who are managing each other." Vera paused. "Nora's staying at the Lamb. She comes to the house in the mornings, but she doesn't stay long. There's something between them that's older than Witchford Parva, if you take my meaning." Miss Marple did take her meaning. She paid for both tea and the seed cake, and walked home to the Purbeck's house, where she sat in the garden for some time with her knitting and thought about what it meant to lock every door. Chapter 4. 4 o'clock at Hazel Lodge. At 8:30 on Sunday morning, Police Constable Warren Dibbs of the Witchford Parva Constabulary knocked at the door of Hazel Lodge and received no answer. He knocked again. He tried the door and found it locked. He went around to the back and found both the back door and every accessible window not merely closed but fastened in the additional manner that Vera Colstock had described. He returned to the front, knocked a third time with some vigour, and then, experiencing the particular unease that attaches itself to locked houses that contain someone who does not answer, fetched his bicycle and rode for Dr. Purbeck. Dr. Gerald Purbeck, a capable and sensible man of 50 with a reputation for keeping his head, arrived at Hazel Lodge at 10 minutes to 9. He and Constable Dibbs gained entry by breaking a small pane of glass in the downstairs lavatory window, which was the only window on the ground floor without the additional catch. They found Miriam Tate in the sitting room. She was in the armchair beside the cold fireplace, which was the most orderly and deliberate-looking death scene that either of them had ever seen. She was dressed, her hands folded, her face composed. There was, to all visual appearances, nothing wrong with her at all, except that she was dead. There was no note. There was an empty glass on the side table that had recently contained something alcoholic, and beside it a small brown bottle that had contained, according to its label, a prescribed sleeping preparation chloral hydrate, 20 tablets. The bottle was empty. Dr. Purbeck estimated that death had occurred between 10 o'clock the previous evening and 2 o'clock that morning. He was, as he told his wife Anne over a very silent breakfast, rather certain that this was not what it appeared to be, but he could not immediately explain why he was certain. Something about the room bothered him. He sat at the kitchen table and tried to put his finger on it and could not. It was Anne who fetched Miss Marple. Miss Marple arrived at Hazel Lodge at 11 o'clock, when the constable had been joined by a detective inspector from Milchester named Royston, a brisk, efficient man of 40, who wore good shoes and had the look of someone who had seen enough to be appropriately sceptical of appearances, though not, Miss Marple suspected, quite sceptical enough of this particular appearance. She was not permitted into the sitting room, which was entirely proper. She stood in the doorway and looked for rather a long time without saying anything. The room told her several things. First, Miriam Tate had been a precise woman. The books on the shelves were ordered by size. The ornaments were arranged with intention. The blanket draped over the arm of the sofa was folded with a neatness that spoke of habit rather than occasion. Second, the room had been recently tidied. There was the circular pressure mark on the side table, where a second glass had stood and been removed. Third, and this was the thing that would, she suspected, be the beginning of everything, one of the interior doors was unbolted. She had been told that every interior door in the house had bolts on both sides. She could see this was true of the door to the hallway, which bore a substantial bolt at chest height, currently drawn back. But the door that connected the sitting room to what appeared to be a study had only one bolt, on the sitting room side, and that bolt was not merely drawn back. It was hanging at an angle, the upper screw slightly pulled from the wood, as though the bolt had been worked from the wrong side at some point, and the strain had not been kind to the fitting. Nobody else appeared to have noticed this. Miss Marple said nothing about it to Detective Inspector Royston, who was, she understood, perfectly capable of arriving at his own conclusions in his own time. She went home and she thought about it, and by tea-time she was fairly sure she understood what had happened, although proof was rather a different matter. Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Business. Mr. Owen Fitch arrived in Wychford Parva on Monday morning, which was, given the circumstances, somewhat sooner than anyone might have expected. He was a solicitor from Shrewsbury, small, precise, with silver-framed spectacles, and the manner of a man who had spent his career delivering news that required the recipient to sit down. He came first to see Detective Inspector Royston, with whom he spent an hour. He then, with the inspector's knowledge, if not precisely his blessing, called on several people in the village. Miss Marple learned this from Mrs. Yell, who had seen his car, a dark green Morris, parked outside the Lamb in the late morning, and then outside Hazel Lodge, and then, rather interestingly, outside the small stone house on Croft Lane, where Philip Carver had taken a room for the week. Miss Marple was in the post office when Mr. Fitch came in to send a telegram, and she introduced herself with the serene imprecision that she found most useful in such situations. She was visiting friends in the village. She had been to the fete. Dreadful business about poor Mrs. Tate. Such a quiet woman. Mr. Fitch, who was clearly under considerable professional strain, found himself explaining things to Miss Marple in the way that people sometimes did, not because she asked searching questions, but because she seemed like someone who would understand things properly and not cause them to be misconstrued. The estate, he said carefully, was not straightforward. Miriam Tate had altered her will 3 months ago. Prior to that alteration, the primary beneficiary had been her daughter, Nora. After it, the primary beneficiary was a charitable trust for the rehabilitation of women, leaving difficult domestic situations a cause, he added, in which Mrs. Tate had evidently taken a personal interest. Nora Tate received under the new will what she would have received under an intestacy, a fixed sum, respectable but not substantial. The house in Shrewsbury, which Mrs. Tate still owned, jointly with someone else, that was a matter the estate would need to resolve through the courts, because the other party on that title deed was not Nora Tate. He stopped himself. He had, he said, probably said more than was strictly his remit. Miss Marple thanked him for his help and bought 2 first-class stamps that she did not immediately need. The name on the title deed would have been useful, but she thought she could reason her way to it. The house in Shrewsbury jointly held a man named Philip Carver, who had spent months trying to find Miriam Tate, a man who had visited Hazel Lodge in March and been turned away on the doorstep, a man who had come to the village fete on Saturday and been granted a 30-minute appointment at 4 o'clock. Miss Marple sat down on the post office bench provided for the elderly, a gesture she found simultaneously considerate and faintly mortifying, and thought about joint ownership. A joint tenancy meant that ownership passed automatically on death to the surviving party. But a tenancy in common meant that each party's share formed part of their estate and could be willed separately. The question of which arrangement applied to the Shrewsbury house was not one Miss Marple could answer from a post office bench in Wychford Parva. She thought, as she often did when confronted with legal arrangements, of old Mr. Swettenham in St. Mary Mead, who had left his house jointly to his wife and his sister on the assumption that they would manage the matter between them, and who had therefore created a situation of such sustained domestic misery that the matter was still not resolved 15 years after his death. Joint ownership was one of those sensible-sounding arrangements that in practice depended entirely on the cooperativeness of the parties, and where cooperative parties were concerned, formal arrangements were rarely necessary in the first place. It was the uncooperative parties for whom the precise legal language mattered, and those parties, almost by definition, would dispute the language. Philip Carver, she was fairly certain, was an uncooperative party. The question was whether he was a dangerous one. She thought about Miriam Tate's words relentlessly, not violent, not threatening in any explicit way, simply persistent, in the way that water is persistent, finding every gap, every weakness, wearing at the stone not with force, but with absolute continuity of pressure. Against that kind of siege, one built walls, one locked door, one relocated to Wychford Parva under a sort of voluntary invisibility. But she could reason about the motive with reasonable confidence. Chapter 6. Nora at the Lamb. The Lamb was Wychford Parva's only public house, a low-ceilinged building of considerable age and moderate comfort, and Nora Tate had taken its only guest room. She was discovered there by Miss Marple at 5:30 on Monday afternoon, sitting alone in the small saloon bar, with a glass of ginger beer and a book she was transparently not reading. Miss Marple, who had a long-standing belief that the appearance of a harmless, slightly forgetful old woman was among the most useful things a person could appear to be, sat down at the adjacent table and said that she was rather tired after all the business of the weekend. Wasn't it dreadful? And she had known Miriam Tate slightly through a mutual friend, and she was very sorry about the young woman's mother. Nora Tate had the eyes of someone who has not slept well for several days. She thanked Miss Marple without warmth, but she did not move away, which Miss Marple took as a form of permission. "You must be devastated," Miss Marple said. "And in such confusing circumstances." Nora said, "The inspector seems satisfied that it was an overdose. Is that what you believe?" The directness of the question appeared to catch the young woman off guard. She looked at Miss Marple properly for the first time. "No," she said, and then, almost immediately, "I shouldn't say that to someone I've just met." "You can say it to me," said Miss Marple. "I'm not a policeman, and I'm very old, and things one says to very old people tend to go no further." This was not entirely accurate, but it was true in the sense that the matter of Miss Marple's discretion was genuine, even if her silence was sometimes strategic. Nora set her book down. "My mother was not suicidal. I know that's what people say about every suicide, but I knew her, and she was not. She was frightened of Philip, of what he might do, but she was fighting, not giving up. She came here to make herself safe, not to find somewhere to die." "Philip Carver," Miss Marple said. "Can you tell me about him?" Nora was quiet for a long moment, in the way of someone deciding how much of a story to tell and from where to begin. "He was my father's business partner. They ran a furniture import business together in Shrewsbury. When my father died 2 years ago, he had a stroke. It was quick, no foul play. I'm certain that Philip argued that half the business was his by right, which was true in a legal sense. What wasn't true, or what my mother disputed, was his claim that half the house was also his. He said there was an informal, unwritten agreement, something my father had promised him. My mother said there was no such agreement. Philip said she was lying. Was she? I don't know," Nora said honestly. "My father was not always careful about these things. He might have said something he shouldn't. But my mother wasn't lying about the will. She had my father's will. She had the solicitor's confirmation. The house was hers outright. Philip had no legal claim, but he wouldn't stop. Letters, phone calls, visits. He said she had cheated him, that she had manipulated my father's estate. He was relentless. And so she ran," Miss Marple said. "She ran. She found Witchford Parver through a property agent who agreed to be discreet, and she came here, and she locked her doors, and she tried to be invisible. She told me not to come, not to contact the solicitor with her new address, because she was afraid Philip would find out through me." Nora paused. She was right to be afraid of that. "I went to Mr. Fitch about the will change, and Philip followed me to his office, and he was very charming. Philip, he convinced the junior clerk that he was a family friend who needed to reach Mrs. Tate urgently. He found her through Mr. Fitch's office," Miss Marple said. "So it seems." Miss Marple considered this. "I saw you speak to him at the fete on Saturday. What did he want?" "What he always wants. He said my mother owed him money, that she'd taken something that was his, and that if she wouldn't settle it privately, he'd take it to court and make everything public." Nora's voice was carefully controlled, the control of someone managing grief and anger simultaneously. "I told him to leave her alone. He said that wasn't his intention. He kept his 4 o'clock appointment," Miss Marple said. "Yes. I don't know what was said. I went to see her that evening at about 7, and she was agitated. She would have said composed, but I know the difference. She said the conversation had been unpleasant, but that she had handled it. I stayed for an hour. She was alive when I left at 8 o'clock. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Was the sitting-room door bolted when you arrived? The interior one?" "Yes, as always. She slid the bolt back to let me in from the hall." "And when you left?" Nora frowned. "I went out through the front door. The sitting-room door I don't specifically remember. She would have bolted it again, she always did." "Was there," Miss Marple asked, "a second glass on the side table when you were there?" Nora thought. Yes. Philip must have had a drink with her. She'd have offered him one, regardless of the circumstances. She was very particular about that sort of thing. She paused. "Why? Just filling in the picture," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Will you have another ginger beer?" Chapter 7. The Gardener's Account. Thomas Breck, the gardener who had been hired and dismissed within 3 weeks of Miriam Tate's arrival, was not a difficult man to find. He was employed now at the rectory, and he was trimming the hedge along the rectory wall on Tuesday morning when Miss Marple walked past with the determined purposelessness of someone with nowhere particular to be. He was about 60, weathered, with the deliberate movements of a man who has learned that speed and thoroughness are not the same thing. He answered Miss Marple's questions with the brevity of someone who does not enjoy speech for its own sake, but also does not see the point of evasion. He had worked for Mrs. Tate for 21 days. He had been let go, he said, not because his work was unsatisfactory. She had actually said she was pleased with the work, but because she had decided she did not want anyone on the property whom she did not absolutely need. She had said so directly, which he appreciated. She gave him a month's wages and a very firm handshake and wished him well. In 21 days he had observed the following things that he considered worth observing. Mrs. Tate was thorough. She had walked the property boundary with him on his first day and shown him where the fence needed reinforcement. She had also pointed out that the latch on the side gate was inadequate and asked him to replace it, which he did. She received, during those 3 weeks, one visitor who came to the back of the gardener's entrance, which was unusual. The visitor was a man, young, perhaps 30, who knocked at the back gate at around noon on his 3rd week, a Thursday. Mrs. Tate came out to the garden herself, which she rarely did, and spoke to this man at the gate for about 5 minutes. Then she sent him away. She did not look frightened of this man, Breck said. She looked sad, tired, the way people look when they are dealing with something they had hoped they would not have to deal with. Miss Marple asked whether he'd heard any of what was said. He had heard one thing, because the man had raised his voice toward the end. He had said, clearly enough to be certain of it, "You can't keep pretending it didn't happen." Mrs. Tate had said something quietly that he hadn't heard, and then the man had gone. "Would you describe him?" Miss Marple said. "Young, dark hair, not from around here," had a slight accent. Regional, he thought, maybe northern. Not the same man as the one who came to the front door in March, which he'd also seen. That one had been taller, older, a different way of carrying himself. More assured, Miss Marple walked on after thanking him, thinking about a young, dark-haired man with a northern accent and the phrase, "You can't keep pretending it didn't happen," and about Nora Tate, with her dark hair and her controlled voice and her book she wasn't reading. She walked slowly, because the morning was fine and because slow walking made for better thinking. The lane along the rectory hedge gave way to the small high street, the bakers, the post office, the newsagents, a modest haberdasher that appeared to survive largely on goodwill and the loyalty of 3 elderly women who still made their own curtains. Beyond these, the village thinned out into the scattered stone houses and kitchen gardens that were really Witchford Parva's predominant geography, despite the impression given by the high street that something more urban was occurring. She passed Hazel Lodge without stopping, though she looked at it. A handsome Victorian house, solid and 4 square, with the additional window catches she had been told about visible from the lane, as slight protuberances against the original frames. The garden was, as Anne Purbeck had noted, going to seed not catastrophically, not the abandonment of someone who had stopped caring, but the steady creep of growth that happens when a garden is not tended with consistency. Thomas Breck had got the beds in good order in his 3 weeks. Since his departure, the edges had softened, grass crept over the path. A climbing rose had come loose from its support and wandered sideways along the front wall. It was the garden of someone whose attention was directed inward rather than outward, who did not feel the garden to be her primary concern. Miss Marple found this detail in keeping with everything else she had understood about Miriam Tate. The woman had been thoroughly concerned with interior security and thoroughly unconcerned with exterior presentation. The bolts, the catches, the locked interior doors are all internal. The garden, the windows as seen from the outside, the impression the house gave to the lane, these were not her preoccupation. She was not building a facade. She was building a refuge. When she arrived home, she asked Anne Purbeck whether Nora Tate had dark hair, and, if so, whether she had a brother. Anne did not know about her brother. Miss Marple wrote 2 letters that afternoon and posted them with the stamps she had bought unnecessarily at the post office. Chapter 8. The Doctor's Doubts. Dr. Gerald Purbeck had been bothered about the sitting room since Sunday morning, and by Tuesday evening he had identified what was bothering him, and it was both simpler and more disturbing than he had thought. He sat with Miss Marple in the garden after supper, in the long light of a July evening, and told her what he had concluded. Anne had gone inside at the first appearance of midges, but Miss Marple, who had been enduring English midges for 7 decades and had reached a philosophical accommodation with them, remained in the garden chair with her knitting and listened with the attentiveness of someone who is not going to let any part of what is being said escape her. "The chloral hydrate," he said. 20 tablets, 10 grains each. That is a substantial dose for a woman of her size and health, almost certainly fatal without very prompt treatment, and there would have been no prompt treatment, given that she was alone in a locked house. So the mechanism is plausible. The problem is the glass. Miss Marple waited. Chloral hydrate dissolves in liquid. It has a strong, unpleasant taste, bitter, recognizable. If a person is intending to take it themselves, they can simply swallow it in a drink, and there's nothing to be said about the taste, because they already know what they're taking. But if a person is given it without their knowledge, they need to be given it in something strong enough to disguise the taste, something with its own powerful flavor. He paused. The glass on the side table contained brandy, a substantial pour. Brandy is, among spirits, among the most effective at disguising bitter additives. "And the second glass," Miss Marple said. "Yes. Someone else was in that room and drinking with her. Someone removed their glass before leaving, which means, at minimum, the death was not the uncomplicated solitary overdose that it superficially appeared to be." He looked at his hands. He had been a doctor for 23 years, and he had seen death in most of its varieties, and he was not easily unsettled. What unsettled him, he said, was not the death itself, but the deliberateness of the presentation, the folded hands, the composed face, the entirely ordinary appearance of a woman who had simply sat down and not got up again. Someone had spent time making it look like that. Someone had arranged the scene with care. "That suggests not panic," Miss Marple said, "but planning, or at least the presence of mind to plan, in the moments after." "Yes, which speaks to a particular kind of person," he paused, "or a person in a particular kind of state, one where the act has not quite connected yet with its consequences, and the mind is still running on its operational logic, doing the next sensible thing and the next." Miss Marple thought of the bolt's damaged screw and said nothing about it yet. She had a strong feeling that Gerald's analysis and her own observation were building toward the same structure from different directions, and she wanted to let them meet naturally. "Have you told Inspector Royston this?" "I told him today. He is, I believe, taking it seriously. He has sent the remaining trace liquid in the first glass for analysis, and he has spoken again to everyone known to have been at Hazel Lodge on Saturday." He paused. "He spoke to Philip Carver this morning. Carver says he kept the 4 o'clock appointment. They had a conversation that he describes as difficult but civil. She offered him a drink and he declined, and he left before 5. "He declined a drink," Miss Marple said. "That's what he says." "That is very interesting," Miss Marple said, "because Nora Tate, who was there at 7, saw a second glass one that had been used. Someone drank with Miriam Tate between 5 and 8 o'clock on Saturday evening." Gerald looked at her. "Unless Carver is lying about declining. Possibly. Or alternatively, there was a third visitor." They sat in silence for a moment, in the particular quality of evening light that is unique to English summers. Warm, golden, slightly surprised at itself. "The young man with the northern accent," Miss Marple said, almost to herself. "From May. The one who came to the back gate." "What young man?" "Someone Mrs. Tate had a previous connection with. Someone she found sad, rather than frightening." She picked up her knitting. "I have written to an acquaintance who lives in Shrewsbury and knows everyone. I hope to have a reply by Thursday." Chapter 9. The letter that arrived on Thursday. The reply came not on Thursday but on Wednesday afternoon, which was better. Miss Marple's acquaintance in Shrewsbury was a retired schoolmistress named Miss Helen Prout, who had an exceptionally retentive memory and almost no respect for privacy where the public good was concerned. They had known each other for 30 years, through the particular network of Anglican ladies of a certain age and intellectual caste, who, despite never having been formally organized, constituted an extremely effective information-gathering apparatus across the southern half of England. The letter was 4 pages, closely written in Miss Prout's small, regular hand. Miss Marple read it twice and then folded it carefully and sat for a time with it in her lap, looking at nothing in particular. Arthur Tate, the late husband of Miriam, had been, by Miss Prout's account, a decent man but not a strong one. He had run the furniture import business with Philip Carver for 12 years, and the partnership had been profitable, and the two men had been considered, in Shrewsbury circles, quite close friends. There had been, Miss Prout wrote delicately, some suggestion that Philip Carver had been closer still to Miriam Tate than was strictly proper, at some point before Arthur's death. The suggestion was exactly that suggestion, not scandal, and had never been substantiated. Miss Prout offered it with characteristic precision. She was not alleging anything, only reporting that it had been alleged. This was interesting, but it was the next paragraph that held Miss Marple's attention most completely. Arthur Tate had had a son by a previous relationship, before his marriage to Miriam. The young man's name was Daniel Farrow. He had taken his mother's name and he was 29. He and Arthur had maintained occasional contact, but the boy had grown up in Yorkshire with his mother, which explained the northern accent. After Arthur's death, Daniel had been left a small legacy in the will, not substantial, but acknowledged. He had also, according to Miss Prout, written to Miriam Tate on 2 occasions in the months after the funeral, and the letters had not been answered. Miss Prout had seen Daniel Farrow in Shrewsbury in March, around the time of the visit to Hazel Lodge's doorstep that Vera Colstock had witnessed. She had not thought much of it at the time. She thought more of it now. Miss Marple set the letter in her lap and considered the arithmetic of it. March, the man on the doorstep, turned away. Vera Colstock hearing, "You can't simply absent yourself from your responsibilities, Miriam. It doesn't work like that." That was too formal, too legalistic for a young man of 29 who had never been acknowledged. That was Philip Carver's language, Philip Carver's mode of argument. The man in March on the doorstep had been Philip, which meant Daniel had come in May, to the back gate. You can't keep pretending it didn't happen. Daniel's sentence was younger, rawer, more personal. Not about a business arrangement, about a fact of existence. So, there had been 3 people with reasons to seek out Miriam Tate, and only one of them, Philip Carver, had been known to the police and the village. The man on the doorstep in March turned away with a glass of brandy for fortification. That had not been Philip Carver, whose confident assurance was nothing like the visit Vera Colstock described. The man at the back gate in May, the one who had made Miriam Tate look sad rather than afraid, that was Daniel Farrow. And Daniel Farrow, who had not been answered and had come in person twice and been turned away twice, who might have felt that Miriam Tate had inherited something that should partly belong to him, who was young enough and bold enough and had possibly had enough of being managed and dismissed. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and said, "Oh dear," which she said, when something that was only a suspicion became something that she believed to be nearly certain. She needed to know whether Daniel Farrow had been in Witchford Parva on Saturday. Chapter 10. What the Landlord Remembered. The Lamb's landlord, a solid man named Bernard Cope, who had run the public house for 20 years and possessed the publican's particular talent for remembering faces without appearing to study them, confirmed on Thursday morning that a young man answering the description of Daniel Farrow had spent Friday night at the Lamb. He had not stayed Saturday night. He had come in at about 6 on Friday, taken a room for one night, ordered a meal, drank 2 pints of ordinary, and been quiet and unobtrusive. He had paid and left on Saturday morning, around 9 or 10, Cope said, which might place him at the fete, or it might not. He had given his name as Daniel Fern, which was almost certainly not his name, but was close enough to Farrow that Miss Marple found it instructive that people lying about their names rarely depart very far from the original. He had, Cope added, asked whether Miss Nora Tate was still staying at the hotel. He had asked this in a roundabout way, as though he was not asking it at all, which meant that Cope had certainly noticed. Cope had confirmed that Miss Tate was indeed staying, and the young man had seemed both relieved and troubled by this information. Inspector Royston, Miss Marple thought, needed to know about this. She was not in the habit of withholding information from the police, only of assembling it into something coherent before she offered it, since she had found that coherent information was received with considerably more seriousness than a series of observations from an old lady. She went to see Nora Tate first. Nora was in the saloon bar again, still with a book she wasn't reading, though it was a different book, which showed some enterprise. She looked, if anything, worse than she had on Monday. The sleeplessness had moved from her eyes to the whole of her face, and she had stopped making the effort of composure. "I need to ask you something directly," Miss Marple said, sitting down, "and I hope you'll answer me directly, because I believe it matters." Nora looked at her. "All right. Do you have a half-brother named Daniel Farrow?" The book went down. Nora's face went through several expressions quickly, too quickly to catalogue in order, and then settled into something that was not surprising, but was rather the expression of someone whose privately held fear has been named aloud by another person. "He's not supposed to know where she was," Nora said. "Did he?" "I don't know. I think he did. He rang me in June. He'd seen Philip outside Mr. Fitch's office. Philip wasn't the only one who managed to follow me there, and Daniel asked me where she was. I didn't tell him, but I think he worked it out. He knew the solicitor's name, and he's clever, Daniel, more clever than he lets on. What does he want from your mother's estate?" Nora looked at the table. "He was in my father's will. He got a small legacy, £500. But there was a letter my father left him, which Mr. Fitch read to him, and the letter said, 'She stopped.' My father told him that if anything should happen to the house in Shrewsbury, meaning if it was ever sold, Daniel should receive a share of the proceeds. It wasn't in the will formally, it was a private instruction, and Mr. Fitch said it had no legal standing, and my mother said my father had no right to commit that money without telling her, and she refused to honour it. The house in Shrewsbury," Miss Marple said, "was it sold? My mother was planning to sell it. The proceeds would have been considerable. Philip was contesting that she could sell it at all because of his claim on the property. Daniel was contesting that he should receive a portion of the sale. My mother was surrounded. That's why she ran." "Was Daniel angry?" Nora's jaw tightened. "He was hurt. He's quite young, and he idolized my father, and I think he genuinely believed my mother would honor the letter. When she wouldn't, he felt betrayed. He came to see her twice, and she refused to discuss it. She said the letter had no legal standing, and she was acting on legal advice, which was all true, but it was not kind." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It was not kind." She sat for a moment looking at the window. "Did you see Daniel on Saturday?" Nora was quiet for too long. "He came to the fete," she said finally. "I saw him there, briefly. I told him to go home. He said he was going to speak to our mother himself. I told him that would be a mistake." She looked up. "Do you think he did something?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the inspector needs to speak to him. Do you know where he is? He gave me a number in Yorkshire. I haven't rung it." She paused. "I should have told the inspector about him." "Yes," said Miss Marple, gently but without qualification. "You should." Chapter 11. A psychological appointment. Detective Inspector Royston had arrived, by Thursday afternoon, at a theory that was internally consistent and supported by the emerging physical evidence. The glass had been sent for analysis. Philip Carver's account was shaky at the edges, in ways that suggested rehearsal rather than recollection. The inspector was building a case around the most obvious candidate, with the most obvious motive: the business dispute, the long harassment, the property claim, and it was not, Miss Marple thought, wrong so much as incomplete. She asked for and was granted a brief interview with Philip Carver at the Lamb on Thursday afternoon, presenting herself to him as a friend of the Purbeck family who had known Miriam slightly and was struggling to make sense of the whole dreadful business. Philip Carver was not a stupid man. He received her with appropriate sympathy and appropriate wariness, the wariness of a man who knows that he is a suspect and has decided that openness is his best strategy. He was, she noted, genuinely distressed, not grief, but the genuine distress of a man whose plans have gone significantly wrong. She let him talk for some time about Miriam. He had known her for 15 years. He had been fond of her, he said, though the business with the estate had damaged that. He accepted that he had behaved badly in some respects, the letters, the visits. He could see, from the outside, how it looked. He had a legitimate grievance about the house, he still believed that, but he did not. He wanted her to understand he was not vindictive. Miss Marple said, "The arrangement you had with Arthur about the house was documented anywhere at all, even informally." He looked at her steadily. "There were emails," he said. "Old ones, from 2014, when we first discussed the idea. Arthur suggested that if anything happened to either of us, the The other one should receive the house. He paused. Miriam said those emails didn't mean what they said, that it was a casual conversation. Maybe she's right, but I believed Arthur meant it. When you saw her on Saturday, Miss Marple said, with the gentleness of someone asking about the weather, how did she seem? She was calm, calmer than I expected. She said she had made a decision about the house, that she was selling it, and there would be nothing for me, and nothing for Daniel. He paused. I asked who Daniel was because she'd said the name as though I should know it. She said Arthur's other child, who you've apparently never met. I hadn't, to be honest. I didn't know about Daniel until the business with the estate. Was she frightened of anyone? Philip was quiet for a moment. I think, he said slowly, that she was afraid of what Daniel might do. She said this toward the end of our conversation. When I was about to leave, she said, "The one I'm not worried about is you, Philip. You're unpleasant and you're greedy, but you're not dangerous. I'm more worried about someone who feels he was never acknowledged." And then she let me out. She let you out, Miss Marple said. Through the front door? Yes. She came with me to the front door and locked it after me. I heard the bolt go across. Not through the sitting room, through the hall. Miss Marple sat back, settled her cardigan, and said that she was very grateful and that he had been most helpful, and she thought he had been quite sincere, though perhaps not quite in the way he had intended. Chapter 12. The Study Door. She went to Hazel Lodge on Friday morning, with Inspector Royston's somewhat reluctant permission and the active cooperation of Vera Colstock, who had been asked to make an inventory of the house for estate purposes and was willing to have company. The sitting room was as she had seen it on Sunday, though the chair had been moved and the glass removed for analysis. Miss Marple went directly to the connecting door between the sitting room and the study. The bolt was on the sitting room side. Its top screw was pulled slightly from the wood. The door itself, when she examined it closely, showed faint marks on the study side near the bolt, the kind of marks left by a thin implement worked through a gap to operate a bolt on the other side. It was not an easy thing to do. It required patience and a steady hand and a tool of the right shape, a length of stiff wire perhaps, or a flat implement that could reach through the slim gap between door and frame. But it was possible. She had known it was possible from the moment she had seen the damaged screw. If someone had entered the house when Miriam Tate was still living, while she still operated normally, they could have concealed themselves in the study. Then, after Nora's visit at 7 and departure at 8, after the household settled and Miriam retired to the sitting room from the study side, with patience and an implement, they could have drawn back the bolt and entered. Miriam Tate, who locked every door, who had bolted the interior door from the sitting room side, would have had no reason to expect that bolt to be worked open from the other direction. Miss Marple looked at the study. It was a small room with bookshelves, a writing desk, a chest of drawers, and a window with the additional catch firmly in place. The window could not have been the entry point. The study connected, however, and here was the important thing, through a second door to the downstairs lavatory. And the downstairs lavatory window was the one without the additional catch. It was a small window, high in the wall, but it was not locked. Someone young and agile enough could have come through that window and into the lavatory and from the lavatory into the study, bolting the lavatory door behind them to conceal the route of entry. She found what she was looking for in the chest of drawers. Not in the drawer itself, but behind it a small amount of dried mud, the kind left by outdoor shoes, brushed hurriedly off a surface and onto the floor where the drawer would conceal it. Someone had stood behind this chest of drawers, waiting. She asked Vera to come and look at the mud without touching it, and Vera confirmed that Miriam Tate cleaned the house with great thoroughness each Friday. Saturday's cleaning was not yet done. The mud was fresh. Miss Marple asked Vera to telephone Detective Inspector Royston. Chapter 13. The Unacknowledged Son. Inspector Royston found Daniel Farrow at a bed and breakfast in Milchester, which was where he had been since Sunday morning. He had not gone back to Yorkshire. He had not, apparently, gone anywhere. He had sat in a room in Milchester for 5 days, which was the behaviour of a man who had not decided what to do next, or of a man who had done something that had not yet connected with the full meaning of what it was. He was 29, dark-haired, with Arthur Tate's eyes in someone else's face. He was not what the inspector had expected, which was either defiance or collapse. He was sitting at the small writing table by the window, his hands flat on the surface, as though he had been measuring something or preparing to write, and had stopped in the middle. He said, I wondered when you'd find me," which was not a confession, but was not denial. He told it plainly, once he began, and he told it in the manner of a man who has rehearsed it to himself many times, but never said it aloud, so that some parts came out smooth and practiced, and others caught and hesitated, where the private rehearsal had always failed him. He had come to Witchford Parva on Friday. He had found the village the way he'd found the address, carefully, patiently, by working backward from the solicitor's office and a property registry, and the name of a letting agent who had been less discreet than he perhaps should have been. He had checked into the Lamb as Daniel Fern and told himself he was only going to look, only going to see where she lived. He had not entirely believed this, even as he told himself it. He had gone to the fete on Saturday morning and seen Nora, which he had not expected. Nora had told him to go home. He had understood, from the way she told him, that she was frightened not of him specifically, but of the entire situation, of what might happen when all the people with grievances occupied the same small space. He felt, he said, the justice of this. He had not gone home. He had watched the house from the lane in the afternoon and seen Philip Carver arrive at 4 and leave before 5. He had waited for it to get dark. He had entered through the lavatory window at around 9:30. The window was small and high and required him to use the drain pipe for purchase and to angle himself through sideways, and it had been undignified and painful, and he had torn his jacket on the latch. He had dropped into the lavatory, bolted the door to the hall from inside, and listened. The house was quiet. He had moved through the connecting door into the study. He had waited in the study. The waiting had been the strangest part, he said. He had been in a woman's house, in the dark, uninvited, and he had sat on the floor behind the chest of drawers because it was the only concealment, and he had heard her moving in the sitting room next door, the small ordinary sounds of a woman settling for the evening, and he had thought about his father, about how Arthur had maintained occasional contact with him over the years, in the particular manner of a man who means well, but cannot quite bring himself to do the full thing, a letter at Christmas, a brief meeting in Shrewsbury every year or so, always with the slightly hurried quality of something fitted between more pressing obligations. He had loved his father for this limited love because it was the only love he had from him. He had resented it for the same reason. He had heard Miriam Tate in the sitting room, heard her moving, heard her settle in the armchair. He had worked the bolt open over the course of perhaps 20 minutes, using a piece of garden wire he had taken from the fence outside. The bolt had resisted at first and then given, and the door had swung inward, and he was through. She had been drowsy. The sleeping preparation she took nightly, a habit of years, had already been in her system for some time, but she had been awake, and she had looked up at him, and there was a moment he could not quite describe it, and he tried in which she had not yet processed what she was seeing. She was a woman who had spent 8 months in a state of careful, organized wariness, and she had locked all her doors and bolted all her windows, and here was someone standing in her sitting room, and for a fraction of a second, her face was simply confused, the confusion of a system that was not prepared for this particular entry point. Then she had focused on his face, and something in her expression had settled, and she had said, "So it's you. It had to be you or Philip, and I'd decided it wasn't Philip." She had been, he said, remarkably calm. Whether that was the sleeping preparation, or whether it was simply who she was, he didn't know. She had offered him a drink, which he had taken, because he couldn't think what else to do, and the ordinary social logic of the gesture had briefly overridden everything else. She had looked at him with an expression that he could not describe, except to say he was not afraid, and not kind, and not unkind, and she had said, "Your father loved you. I want you to know that. He loved you and he didn't know how to say it, and he was a coward about it, and I'm sorry I couldn't be more generous about the money, but you should go home." He had looked at the side table while she spoke, and saw the brown bottle of chloral hydrate tablets. He had known what they were because his mother had taken the same preparation for years, for her nerves, a prescription she had had renewed annually since before he was born. He had known the word chloral since childhood, in the way that children know the names of the things that mark their household as particular, and Miriam Tate had turned her head for a moment to look at the window at a sound from outside, something ordinary, a cat perhaps or a fox, and something in him had moved. He had used the remaining tablets from the bottle and her drink. He had not counted them. He had not thought about it in those terms, a count, a calculation. He had just done it, in the window of inattention, the way one does a thing that some part of the self has been edging toward without the other parts knowing. She had drunk. She had said, "The brandy tastes peculiar." She had looked at him for a long moment. He did not know if she understood. He thought she might. She had set the glass down and looked at her hands. He had taken the second glass, his own. He had left the way he came. Bolting the lavatory door from outside through the window had been the most difficult part, requiring the garden wire again and another 20 minutes of patient work in the dark, and all of it conducted in a state of peculiar clarity, as though the operative part of his mind was running entirely separately from the part that was beginning, very slowly, to understand what he had done. He had not been able to sleep since Sunday. Inspector Royston, listening to this, wore the expression of a man to whom clarity has arrived at a significant cost. Miss Marple, who had been permitted to sit in the hallway and who heard all of this through the open door, sat very still. She thought about Miriam Tate, who had locked every door and bolted every interior room and fitted every window with an additional catch, and who had never thought to lock the one window that was too small to matter, the one window in the downstairs lavatory that a young man of 29 could force himself through if he was determined enough and thin enough and had spent months building the kind of grievance that makes a person surprisingly determined. She thought about the phrase, "You can't keep pretending it didn't happen," which Daniel had said at the back gate in May, and how she had assumed it referred to the money, to the letter, to the inheritance, and perhaps it had. Or perhaps it had referred to something simpler and more devastating to the fact of his existence, to the years during which Miriam Tate had maintained the household of Arthur Tate, without ever acknowledging, except when legally forced to, that he had a son by another woman. There are many things people feel owed. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous debts are the ones denominated not in money but in recognition. Chapter 14. The Garden in the Evening. The inquest was opened and adjourned, and Daniel Farrow was charged, and Philip Carver returned to Shrewsbury with the look of a man reprieved, but not entirely certain he deserves reprieving, and Nora Tate made arrangements for her mother's funeral with the composure of someone who has no emotional resources left, but is determined to behave correctly regardless. She came to see Miss Marple the day before the funeral, on a Wednesday evening when the summer had turned briefly cool and Gerald Purbeck had lit the sitting-room fire. She sat across from Miss Marple in the small chair by the window and said, "He'll say it was an accident, that he didn't mean to, that she was drowsy and he panicked." "He may," Miss Marple said. "Do you think that's true?" Miss Marple looked at the fire for a moment. "I think that what people mean and what they do are not always in agreement, and that the distinction is both important and insufficient. What he did was deliberate. Whether it was planned days, weeks beforehand, or whether it came upon him at that particular moment, in that particular room, standing over a woman who had denied him for his entire life, that is for a court to decide, or perhaps for something beyond a court." Nora was quiet. "I didn't tell you about him," she said, "when you first asked." "No. I suppose I thought I hoped yes," Miss Marple said simply. "Was it obvious? That it was him rather than Philip?" Miss Marple considered this. Philip Carver had a grievance, but he also had a rational understanding that he had no legal claim and that his behaviour had been, by any reasonable measure, abominable. He had also, when I spoke to him, genuine knowledge of what your mother feared, and it was not him. He quoted her. She said she wasn't worried about him. That's not something a murderer quotes unless he is very sophisticated indeed. And Philip's sophistication is of the social variety, not the psychological. She paused. Daniel, on the other hand, had been denied not money primarily, but recognition. He had never been let in. He had tried, twice, to speak to your mother and been turned away. And he entered the house in the one way that circumvented all of her precautions, not through force, but through a gap that she had left because she couldn't quite imagine someone caring enough to use it. She thought a small window didn't matter. She thought her danger was adult and formal and came with a name she already knew. She was wrong about that. Nora looked at her hands. "Will you stay in Witchford Parva long?" "A little while. I have my knitting to finish, and Anne Purbeck has not yet recovered from having a murder on her doorstep, which is understandable. She finds it helpful to talk about it." "I imagine you find most things helpful to talk about," Nora said, with the first approximation of a smile that Miss Marple had seen from her. "I find most things helpful to observe," Miss Marple said. "Talking is often how I understand what I have already seen." After Nora had gone, Miss Marple sat in the sitting room for a time after Gerald and Anne had retired. The village was very quiet, as it always was by 9 o'clock, its 400 souls settled into their routines. Through the window, she could see the lane, silver-grey in the light from the street lamp, and beyond it, the hedge, and beyond that, the darkness of the fields. She thought about locks. She had been thinking about them since the first morning, since Anne had told her about the bolts on every interior door and the catches on every window, about the woman who had come to a village and made herself a fortress. There was something understandable about it, and something that had always troubled her slightly. Not the fear, which was rational, but the completeness of the defense. The faith that if only one sealed oneself in tightly enough, the danger would not find a way. Danger, in Miss Marple's long experience, was not deterred by locks. Danger was deterred by understanding where it actually came from, which was almost never the direction one was facing. Miriam Tate had faced Philip Carver, who was large and loud, and had written her letters and appeared on her doorstep. She had not faced Daniel Farrow, who was quiet and young and hurt, and had twice gone away when she asked him to, which she had taken as a sign of harmlessness rather than as a sign of patience. She had locked the door she feared and left the window she didn't, and in the end it was the window that mattered. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. She was making a pair of socks for her nephew Raymond's birthday, grey wool, practical, and worked 2 more rows before the mantel clock struck 9:30. Then she folded the knitting away, turned off the reading lamp, and went to bed. Outside, Wychford Parva settled back into its ordinary smallness. The fet bunting had been taken down. The grass on the green was recovering its shape. Mrs. Goss had sent a card to the Tate family. The tombola prizes had been claimed, all but the pot of marmalade, which sat on the shelf behind the WI counter, waiting for its winner to collect it. Modest pleasures, and all the more comfortable for it. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, something else would happen. Something always did, if one waited long enough and paid close enough attention. Miss Marple slept soundly and woke, as she always did, at 6 o'clock when the birds began.